All right, before we get to First Peter, we're going to talk about ideology. And this is going to be based on Rikki Watts. Watts suggests that ideology is that all-pervasive interpretive framework by which a group not only understands itself, but also justifies and projects itself over against other groups. Okay? So ideology is what binds us together as a group. Okay? So what it means to be American, or what it means to be AME Zion, or it's the framework out of which we think. Okay? The function of ideology, he says, the formative influence of the community's founding moment is effected in the present through the action of ideology, which serves to bridge the historical distance between the inaugural event and present social consciousness, and thereby to foster social cohesion. This is done first by conveying the convictions of the founding fathers such that they become those of the community, and second, by propagating the energies of the founding moment beyond their first effervescence into the future. Okay? Ideology transforms an historical singularity into the typical and cyclical. Okay? So, for example, when I was at a church in Vancouver, we needed to raise some money to restore the sanctuary building. Okay, building campaigns, they're fairly common in churches. But the way the pastor kicked it off was he said, 70 years ago, or whatever it was, when this church was founded, the members came together and they rolled up their sleeves and they built this building. Okay, now it's our turn. Only we're not going to roll up our sleeves and physically build it. We're instead going to roll up our sleeves and reach into our back pocket and pull out our wallets and put the money in the plate that will enable us to do this. So what does he do? He says, this is who we are. We are the church that comes together to build the building. Okay? And so the energy that animated the original group to build the structure is now being invoked again to motivate people to contribute towards fixing up the building. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because that's who we are. We are the church that comes together to build the building when it needs to be done. To take an example from politics, a few years ago we had the emergence of the Tea Party. Well, why did they call themselves that?
I guess it was related to the Boston Tea Party of historical times of when they dumped all the tea over into the river, and I guess you got to go from there.
Yeah, and what were the original Boston Tea Partiers protesting? Government overreach, right? We're being taxed without representation, and so why did they call themselves the Tea Party? Well, they are calling back to America's founding moments, saying we represent the true heirs of what America was founded on those founding ideals, this kind of, preventing government overreach and that kind of thing. And so that's why they're using that icon of Tea Party, right? It's a textual symbol that harkens back to the founding of our country. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Another example, we'll include Watts into this. He's from Australia, but he studied at Gordon Conwell. And when he was in one seminary class, the professor said 7 years ago. And so he went and asked his classmates afterwards, what happened 87 years ago? And they're like, nothing that I'm aware of. Why? It's like, because the professor mentioned something that happened 87 years ago, and everybody seemed to know what he was talking about. Like, no, he didn't. It's like, yes, he did. He mentioned something that happened 87 years ago. No, he never said, he said 7 years ago. Oh, he wasn't referring to 87 years ago. He was instead, what? Invoking the first phrase of the Gettysburg Address. Right? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, a couple things to note. One, 77 years ago became a textual symbol that invoked the whole speech. Okay? It's not a reference to 87 years ago. Also, note what Lincoln is doing here. He is himself referring back to the founding of the nation, drawing upon those energies, saying we're essentially doing the same thing. We are giving rebirth to the freedom that was birthed at the beginning of our nation. Okay, that's what the 87 years ago, back at the founding of our nation. So Lincoln is himself doing that here. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Watts also points out that ideology has to be presuppositional in nature. Okay? So he says, for ideology to be unifying and socially cohesive, it must not only provide an interpretive schema, but this schema must also become the atmosphere in which the group as a whole lives and thinks. Ideology, therefore, is not propositional, but presuppositional, and not just for some, but for the whole group. In other words, if you are an American, you really don't have to argue that freedom is an important ideal. Right? It's just kind of ingrained in us that freedom is important. Okay? Does that make sense? Because that's the ideology that we have been inculcated with. Because that's what our nation was founded upon. All right? How do we inculcate ideology? Well, through reenactments, retellings, and rituals that celebrate the community's founding moment. All right? A preeminent example of this is the Passover Haggadah that Jews say every year at Passover. What do they say? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Not our forefathers. We were slaves. They're creating that identification. Okay? And the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt, and everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. Okay? So who are Israel? Well, they are the people whom God brings out of slavery through Exodus. And Exodus then ends up shaping everything about their society pretty much. Okay? If you think about America, how do we inculcate ideology? Well, through things like the Pledge of Allegiance. We sing the Star-Spangled Banner before all of our sporting events. We celebrate the 4th of July, our Independence Day, right? And these are annual, that at least is an annual reminder of what our country was founded upon. Okay? What about in the church? How do we inculcate ideology?
Like our creeds and stuff, and our communion rituals and stuff.
Yeah. We get together every Sunday, or at least we used to before we went into quarantine. Why? In part to remember who we are. Right? And then we celebrate communion and other rituals, baptism, things like that. We say creeds that create a continuity and that remind us again of what it is that we believe. We read Scripture, right? Because those things define who we are as the people of God. Watts goes on He says, since ideology constitutes the group's overall interpretive framework, its schematizing tendency inevitably impresses its categories on the community's understanding of its subsequent history, which itself is also simplified and schematized. In other words, ideology, because it's got to link everybody, is not some scholarly analysis with lots of footnotes, and it's got to be kind of basic, schema. Okay, so for example, Israel's view of her history, at least as recorded in its scriptures, seems then to be structured around several major events or periods: creation, patriarchs, Exodus, conquest, monarchy, exile, return, with the culmination to be found in some sort of expectation of a greater restoration. Interestingly, in nearly every case, these events are related to key personalities. For example, Adam, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, various prophets, and apparently some sort of messianic figure. Furthermore, these events themselves tend to be described in ways which bring out their continuity with the concerns, themes, and trajectories of the founding moment. Okay? Now, note these categories that he comes up with: creation, patriarchs, Exodus, conquest, monarchy, exile, return, that are associated with Adam, Abraham, Moses, David, various prophets, and a messianic figure. Does that sound familiar?
Like the thing we did last class?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. The framework. It's using this kind of schemified understanding of Israel's history that's focused around key figures and big periods. Okay? He then points out this quasi-hierarchical relationship of ideology's iconic and symbolic shorthand facilitates identification of precise areas of ideology's map. Certain icons or symbols, either singly or in combination, indicate which general event within the overall schema is in view, while others, once the general event has been identified, serve to focus attention more precisely on a particular aspect of that event. In other words, ideology can function like a map. Okay? Some icons can give you the big picture of where you are in the map, which map we're using, while others pinpoint where you are. Okay? So for example, we talked about in 1 Corinthians, it seems to be using an Exodus schema, but within that Exodus schema, it pinpoints where are the Corinthians. They're in the post-Sinai wilderness, right? So within Exodus, you can then pinpoint more precisely where you are. Now, what happens in times of crisis? It is when the realities actually experienced by the group are unassimilable through the principal schema, when novelty seriously threatens the possibility for the group to recognize itself, that new interpretations or even formulations of the regnant ideology become imperative. At this point, ideology is no longer quiescent, but its opinions, forced by events from the shadows into the foreground of more conscious thought, must in some way be defended if they are to continue as opinions. So, for example, we talked about freedom being kind of a natural attribute that we prize as Americans. Well, right now we're facing a crisis that is causing the government to impose limits on our freedoms, right? And so now we're having these discussions about, well, is freedom ultimately what we're about, or are there other things that come into play? Does that make sense? And so we're having this debate about whether we should mandate that everybody has to stay at home, or whether it's okay for some to come out and work, and those kinds of things. We're also similar kinds of conversations over FISA authority. What level of government intrusion into private lives is acceptable in a country founded on freedom? And so now you actually have to defend, well, no, freedom is still worth holding on to or championing, because others are now saying, well, no, security should take precedence. Right? And so it's causing us to reevaluate what it means to be American. Now, when your ideology is called into question by circumstances, you have three options. One is to basically deny the present and affirm the past. That's the kind of ostrich in the sand, head in the sand approach, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just I'm going to hold to what I believe no matter what. You can repudiate the past along with its interpretive ideology. Or you can attempt to reconfigure or reinterpret the ideological schema in order to demonstrate that the group's ideology can actually account for the present. So, for example, the destruction of the temple and exile. Right? Israel understood themselves to be God's people, and his presence was invested in the temple such that other nations wouldn't be able to come against it. Except what happened? Other nations came against it and destroyed it. So what do you do with that? Well, as an Israelite, you could deny the present and affirm the past. Well, no, it doesn't matter. God's still with us. Whatever happened, happened. But this is like the rabbis who continue to debate the intricacies of sacrifice, even after the temple has been destroyed. It's not because they're getting ready to go out and do sacrifice. It's just because they're, in anticipation of it being started again one day. Option 2 is to repudiate the past along with its interpretive ideology. Well, obviously, that whole thing about God was wrong. Forget that. I'm done with that. Okay? You see this a lot with kids who grow up in more fundamentalist homes that go off to college and then have professors who point out issues with the Bible. And then what happens? They say, well, I was lied to my whole life. Forget that whole religion thing. I'm done with Christianity. Right? Or you could attempt to reconfigure or reinterpret the schema to show how it still accounts for the community's present. So, for example, the prophets say, look, God's going to come and judge us because we've been sinful. So it's not a comment on his power, it's a comment on our sinfulness when we get conquered by other nations. Right? Or again, the conquest narratives. Okay, so you've got archaeologists who come along and say, well, we found absolutely no evidence of the conquest that is described in Joshua. Well, how do people respond to that? Well, some say, well, those are just academic scholars. Forget them. I know what my Bible says. Okay, that's option 1. 2, people say, well, forget Christianity. Forget the Bible. It's obviously wrong. It's just propaganda. I'm done with that. Or 3, you get people who say, well, maybe those stories in Joshua are allegories. They're not actually describing conquest, but they're just allegories for different traits that are important. So they come up with different ways of interpreting it such that it can still be consistent with the present. Now, some people may find that compelling and others may not. And so then you've got the potential for kind of a split in the community if your reinterpretation is not judged to be compelling by a significant group. Well, how do you go about reconfiguring a schema? Well, it says, since the media of ideology are the icon and symbol, one way of accomplishing this reconfiguring of the ideological schema to account for the present is by redefining and reinterpreting ideology's component icons and symbols, or by bringing together previously unrelated symbols or icons so that new ways of seeing are opened up in order to explain the previously unexplainable present. So how does this work? Well, think about crucified Messiah. Okay, Israel had traditions of suffering, and they had traditions of a Messiah who was going to come and deliver them. What they didn't have were traditions that brought these two things together. Okay, so when Jesus ends up being crucified, the way the biblical authors explain it is to pull on these two traditions in Israelite scriptures and bring them together. Okay? Or again, what does this signify, this symbol?
Black power.
Okay, good. Yeah, the black raised fist tends to be a symbol of black power. Well, what happens when you juxtapose it with this?
It means the Statue of Liberty.
Okay? At the very least, it causes you to think for a minute, right? And it potentially opens up new ways of seeing or thinking about what it means to be an African American Christian. For example, right? What does it mean to combine, attributes of black power with the crucified one? Okay, how can you hold on to those two traditions in forming, who you understand yourself to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you see how combining icons and symbols from your heritage can open up new avenues for thinking about how to configure things and understand who you are. Watts goes on to say, given the sorts of examples just noted, this naturally raises the possibility of alienating members of the group, since it necessarily requires a realignment of old patterns of thinking, which they, for various reasons, may not be willing to accept. This new perspective may either appear improbable or unpersuasive. Once this happens, debate may well follow as to who are the true heirs of the community's traditions, which is then carried out in terms of fidelity to the ideals and energies of the community's founding moment. So, for example, Paul and the law, right? Paul went through and said, given Jesus' resurrection, it makes more sense to understand the law's role in this way. It isn't actually leading to life by you do it better and better. Rather, it puts you to death as you transgress it into Christ and enables you to be unified with him. Well, there were a lot of people who couldn't accept that reconfiguration. It was too much for them. Okay? Or again, women in the church, women in leadership. Right? There are, again, I've suggested, don't surrender the text. Come up with a better way of reading them. In a sense, that's realigning the way we have understood them, what we've understood them to mean. But you're going to have some people who, nope, this is the way I've always understood it, and I'm sticking with it, and that's what it's going to be. So, as we think about the church, think about this. What ideology is your church inculcating, and how does it do it? Have you noticed that when churches switch from hymnals to projecting words on a screen, many times the older members don't like that change?
Yes.
Well, think about what that communicates. A hymnal, the words are always there. You can always go pick it up and look at it, and they don't change. What happens when the word becomes ephemeral? There 1 minute and gone the next. In a religion that claims to, worship the word. Jesus is the ultimate word. But also, the words of the book being our fundamental instruction. Well, what does it mean when those become ephemeral and can be there 1 minute and change the next? Or again, what is our order of worship? Where, for example, does offering fall? And what does that communicate? What does our order of worship indicate about what we emphasize? Right? Is it all about the preached word? Does that get elevated over worship? So thinking about those kinds of issues, okay? The things that we do every week without thinking about it. And what kind of ideology is that inculcating? Okay? Is it individualistic or communal? What does it communicate when everybody gets their own little cup and their own little wafer?
That is about the individual.
Versus everybody coming up and taking from one loaf.
That is the community up there.
Right? Yeah, and again, it's not to say one is right or one is wrong, but think about what you're actually communicating and inculcating through these rites and practices. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then again, think about what rites do we do that reinforce the church's ideology. How do you broach change in a tradition-bound congregation?
Tell us, Dr. Trick.
What I would say, and I'll do this quickly, is try to show them that the change you're suggesting is actually more consistent with who they know themselves to be. Right? So if you come in and say, look, you're doing this wrong, this is how we need to do it, they're going to take that as an attack on themselves and who they know themselves to be as members of such and such church. But if you can come in and say, and draw from their history and tradition and say, look, this is what this church has always been about, this is a better way of expressing that in the here and now, then you're affirming who they know themselves to be and saying this is just a better way of expressing it. Right? Now, again, you're going to get some who resist regardless because they're set in their ways. But that's a better way to get people on board with what you're doing than coming in and directly challenging who they understand themselves to be.